Good afternoon, everyone. I am Marta Hernandez, Executive Director of Californians Together, and I welcome you to our Support for Immigrant and Refugee Students Statewide Convening, focused on building resilience. I want to thank you for joining us to learn about the current context for immigrant students and to discuss the critical role that we each play in supporting the education, health, and well-being of these students. We have an amazing program spotlighting the voices of students, parents, medical professionals, and attorneys. We, of course, are coming together to focus on a historically marginalized community that is bearing the brunt of the pandemic's effects. The pandemic may pose risks to everyone, but inequities in our health and education systems, food insecurity, anti-immigrant and refugee policies, and stress and anxiety results in significantly more harm to children of immigrants and refugees. We know that immigrants work in essential jobs, and this means that these workers face unique pressures to balance risks to their health against economic imperatives to keep working during the pandemic. Many times, parents are not available to provide guidance for their children in distance learning, exacerbating the learning loss that their children are experiencing. This forum is intended to support you in strengthening systems that help build individual and community resilience to be responsive to the needs of California's immigrant and refugee students. And again, I welcome you. At this time, I will turn it over to Ruth Barajas, Director of the Support for Immigrant and Refugee Student Project. Ruth?
Thanks, Martha. Good afternoon, everyone. We have a very diverse group of professionals and leaders in many different areas with us today, and I just want to welcome all of you. I would like to, could you please turn the slide? I'd like to give you a little logistics on how we're gonna work things. Move the slide, thank you. Feel free to use throughout the program the chat box. We would like this to be an engaging opportunity for people to comment, to congratulate, any kinds of feedback or resources that you'd like to include in the chat box. We'd like it to be interactive throughout the day, and we'll also be gathering questions from any of the speakers to be able to help them to respond to you. Also, if we're going to start the day with a little, what we call a Mentimeter, and so if you have an ability to scan a Q code, or you could type in this website that is right below, and we'll put that also in the chat. We'd like you to please help us start the day by writing a word or phrase of what you hope to learn or contribute today during our convening. And as you're doing that, we'll be able to see what it is that we're all coming to the table with. I come here and I'm holding space for my immigrant friends and family members who may not be able to be here and speak up for themselves, but I'm here for them. And so please, you can also enter any of those comments in the chat as well. So people are here for so many different reasons, contributing to understanding, support, advocacy, voice, social justice, how to help our immigrant community to be the voice, wanting to learn more about immigrant students, equality, how to support marginalized students. Some have come to help build partnerships, inspired to be better at what we're doing in supporting students. Perspectives, support, learning more, what's done across the state, learning more about that, help to build community, understanding perspective. Wonderful. Thank you for all those contributions. And we'll put a link to the results in our in our next step. So as we begin the day, as I said, we want to be here for the voices of all of our immigrant students. And so we're going to begin with the voice. We're going to begin with the voice of Kaya Lomeli. You can move the slide, please. Kaya Lomeli is a senior in the Core Humanities Magnet at Cleveland High School, where she contributes to the Writer's Block magazine, and she plays on the basketball team. Her hobbies include Girl Scouts, Sea Scouts, youth in government, skateboarding, and surfing. She recently published her first chapbook, Folding Weights, through Get Lit's Emerging Writings Fellowship. And she views poetry as a way to experience the world and connect with others. So without further ado, we're going to begin with the voice of a student to kick off this special event. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here today. And without further ado, I guess, I'm very excited to share my experience with you and to just hear what everyone here is going to take away, and like just experiencing the community with all of you and feeling motivated to make change. So this is my poem entitled Mercy. The crucifix on her wall watches her get ready for work, pulls her shoes on, carefully says goodbye to her wizened mother, who makes sure she remembers her name and how to get home. Her memory's going, you see. The doctors call it depression, but at least it's not Alzheimer's. I don't know any of this firsthand. I want to say thank you to God for watching her. Even though I don't believe in him, she is convinced an angel pulled her from that car crash, and God is what has kept her half an ocean away from a husband who abused her. They still pray for each other's health, still in love after 30 years. His grace has kept her here. I don't know any of this firsthand. My first grade teacher who moved here looks for her at her job at Sam's Club, but she's lost in the same aisles she's stalked for years. Reminds me of her mother, who cleaned hotel rooms when she got here, and the weight of this history hangs between my shoulder blades. I don't know any of this firsthand. Look at all of the things we shield our children from so they can transition a little easier. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I was so afraid of her accent and her edges. I was so afraid she wouldn't love me that I never gave her a chance to. I am so afraid she won't remember me because I never gave her a reason to. But at least the doctors say it's just depression. Immigrants don't believe in mental illness, just hard work. But that is all 30 years in retail has given her. No health care, but she still says thank you. She thanks God for giving her daughters, even though they don't talk anymore. She thanks America, even though it forgot her birthday. It strikes me that she would have less to celebrate, but she does anyway. I've just learned that her name means mercy. I think I understand it now. I want to say sorry to my grandmother who I never got to know. She's still alive, but now I have all this time to mourn everything she did not have. Thank you.
Feel free to unmute yourselves and
Thank you. Wow, that was amazing. That was beautiful, and I love something that you said was immigrants don't believe in health, don't believe in mental illness, only hard work. I am Romanian, and that's how my father operates as well, and it breaks my heart. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing just a little bit of your truth. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we hope you'll stay with us, Kaya, throughout the day. We have a powerful program lined up, and we're so thankful to have your voice to begin it. So I would like to now introduce you to the person who is going to be giving us an introduction to our day. Dr. Aguilar Casiola is an internationally renowned expert on mental health and ethnic populations. As on-site principal investigator of the Mexican American Prevalence and Services Survey, the largest mental health study conducted in the United States on Mexican Americans, he identified the most prevalent mental health disorders in the Mexican origin population in California's Central Valley. showed that the rate of disorders increases the longer the individual resides in the United States, and demonstrated that children of immigrants have even greater rates of mental disorders. From this study, he developed a model of service delivery that increased access to mental health services among Central Valley's low-income, underserved, and rural population. He is the coordinator for Latin America and the Caribbean of the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey, and coordinates the work of the National Mental Health Institute surveys in Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Costa Rica, and Portugal. Dr. Aguilar-Garciola is the author of over 190 publications. He's the recipient of multiple international, national, state, and local awards, including a distinguished member of the top 10 US Latino physicians in the May of 2016 issue of Latino Leaders magazine. And more recently, he received the OTIL Award, the highest honor granted by the Mexican government to individuals who have dedicated their lives to improving the well-being of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and other Latinos in the US and abroad. I can't think of a better person to help us kick off our event. Welcome, Dr. Aguilar-Garciola.
Well, thank you so much, Ruth, for that kind of introduction. And also thank you to Kaya for that powerful story that, really moving, and that it can be the story of thousands of immigrants, thousands of refugees, not only across the US, but across the world. And so thank you, Kaya, for sharing your story. And I want to thank you, Ruth, Martha Hernandez, and Crystal, and others who organized this event. And I'm honored that you invited me to say a few words. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen, and I have just a few slides that I would like to share with all of you. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Just to let you know that I have developed my career studying migration and health, and have continued to work in this area. I'm passionate about it. I'm an immigrant myself from a small town in the state of Sinaloa in Mexico. And my three of my 4 children were born in Mexico, in Guadalajara, and the youngest was born here in California, in Fresno. And, I'm really fascinated with the stories and with the lives and the challenges that the immigrants have in their journey coming to the US or going to other places. And one of the incredible factors related to that is resilience. So I love that how you call this particular event, building resilience, because I think that is so important to highlight that, especially not only because of the multiple challenges that immigrants and refugees are confronted with, but now with the layer of complexity added by the pandemic and the very negative impact that is having in Latino populations, among other populations, and especially in immigrant and refugee populations, that is important to think about resilience. So let me share with you a few thoughts related to this topic. A key question is, what drives migrant youth from their country of origin make the dangerous journey to the US? And there are several reasons that I want to share with you. We have studied this question, and not only with youth, but with families, and now more recently with children who, as I'm sure all of you know, have been separated from the parents, most recently in the last couple of 3 years, even before then. So one reason is to escape the not only harsh, I would say, just devastating conditions that immigrants have from their country. Also to secure a better future, specifically on work and education for themselves and their family left behind. Many immigrants, as we have seen and studied, they come with a very clear understanding that they are willing to sacrifice a lot of their lives with the promise of giving education and finding better jobs for their children primarily. Also to reunify with parents and family. And something that I once again want to emphasize is that the youth's migration paths are multidimensional. And every youth's journey is a story of resilience. I have been studying issues related to migration and trauma. And I'm very glad that Dr. Andres Schola, who is a friend, is going to be sharing much more in-depth information with you later in the program. But one of the common experiences of migration is trauma, especially when there is forced migration. And there are a couple of traumatic experiences that I want to bring your attention to. One is that there are single events like being assaulted, witness domestic violence, rape, being robbed, etc. And also the chronic form, which is ongoing physical, sexual, and psychosocial abuse, and maltreatment and neglect. And this is important because, very important because lately we had come to have a much better understanding about what is called the adverse childhood experiences. And these are emotional, physical, sexual abuse, family violence, parental loss, parental psychiatric or substance abuse disorders, and neglect. And part of the research that we have done as part of the World Mental Health Survey Consortium, we have documented that the strongest predictor of early mental illness and also premature aging, or developing chronic health conditions like diabetes are childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences. And this, the implications of ACEs is that there are, once again, mental and physical health problems that are developed early in life. So this brings me to the notion and the focus of this event, which is resilience. Briefly, resilience is one's capacity to face and overcome adversities and persist toward achieving life's goals. It is a protective factor, and please keep this in mind, that help us overcome challenges and adapt to new environments. Simply put, it is our human essence to survival, something that is so much needed during these times, because in addition of just the trauma associated to migration, we have the added layer of surviving the pandemic, and here in California, in some places, also surviving the fires. So why is resilience important to youth's well-being? Well, resilience, as I mentioned already, is a protective factor. It really shields us against negative consequences, short-term and long-term. Also helps youth feel a sense of belonging. This sense of belonging translates to the youth's active participation to school and community life, and also helps youth self-regulate emotions and behaviors and improve their motivation and engagement, for example, in school. So please keep that in mind. I think that one of the things that sets immigrants and refugees apart is, it has puzzled me for many years. Why some, even when they have similar experiences related to migration, one, become depressed or become, with severe substance abuse disorders as well, while others, in spite of facing so many negative circumstances, continue to thrive. Well, in conclusion, migrants and refugees are resilient people, and that's what sets them apart, as I mentioned to you. Youth migrant experience is a strength, a story of courage and tenacity, and a story of struggle, a story of survival, an asset to the U.S. Future. And what comes to mind is DACA students, which I'm amazed about how resilient they have been and continue to be, and their families as well. When migrant youth accept and embrace their immigrant experience, they discover their resilience. And with resilience, I can tell you, because I have seen it over and over again, that youth are more likely to self-manage prior and future traumas, find their sense of purpose, their sense of belongingness, participate in the workforce, and ultimately improve their futures. This is my last slide, and I want to bring to your attention this state and beyond California and Mexico and other countries, this initiative that is called the Border Humanitarian Health Initiative. And you can find it in the website. But what I want to share, this is the last thoughts, is that it is so important to keep in mind in the context of immigrants and refugees, some super goals or the main goals that we need to keep in mind. And what are the things that we ought to focus efforts on? One is to reduce health burden on migration. And along with that, there are things like reduce illness, improve public health, address unique health and mental health needs of this vulnerable population, mitigate the long-term impact of ACEs, as I mentioned to you. But the other one is so important and is an imperative for all of us to protect the human rights and dignity of migrant populations. And within this, reduce exploitation of migrants, minimize criminal risks and impact, and establish minimum treatment standards for migrants. So I'm delighted to be a part of this program, as I mentioned to you, and my very best wishes for a wonder and congratulations for a wonderful program. So I'm going to stop here. And thank you again, Ruth and Maria and others. Marta, excuse me, and others.
Thank you, Dr. Aguilar Calciola. We really appreciate those comments, and we are just so grateful for you for all the work you've done and that you continue to do. Our next group will be introduced by Ana Graciela Nájera Mendoza, who is a staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union, and she will be introducing our next panel. Ana?
Thank you, Ruth. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ana Mendoza, and I'm an education equity staff attorney with the ACLU Foundation of Southern California. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our three presenters who will provide you with information on the legal and policy landscape that impacts immigrant students and communities in California. We won't be able to go in depth into many of the topics today, so in case you want to continue learning more after today, we put together a handout listing various resources that you can review with topics like immigrant and students' rights, understanding public benefits for immigrants, and more. Our presenters' full bios are in your program materials, so I encourage you to review them for more in-depth information about each of them. I will introduce all three presenters first in the order in which they will present. So our first presenter is Ariel Brown, who will share information such as the immigration impact of using public benefits. Ariel is a staff attorney with the Immigrant Resource Legal Center, where her work includes writing and updating practice advisories and manuals, and presenting on family-based topics in immigration law for practitioners. Our second presenter is Maria Romani, who will share information about what immigration enforcement and detention look like in California and our state's responses to these actions. Maria is an immigrant rights policy attorney with the ACLU of Northern California, where her work includes holding governments accountable to the promise of SB 54, the California Values Act. Our third presenter is Deborah Escobedo, who joined us at this convening last year and will share her work advocating for policies and practices to support immigrant students in schools. Deborah is a senior attorney at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area, where she leads the organization's educational equity initiatives. Please use the Q&A or chat features to pose your questions to the presenters, and we will do our best to answer your questions after all of our presenters have provided their presentations. Thank you, and with that, I will turn it over to Ariel.
Great, thanks, Anna. So I'm going to give a very brief legal background on public charge, including the current status of public charge. But I want to first start by acknowledging that this nebulous concept may raise a variety of concerns for immigrants and mixed status families, including whether a public charge means that they cannot participate in public benefits programs, whether it means they may not be able to immigrate in the future, and whether it might lead to them being deported. So importantly, public charge does not change eligibility for public benefits. If a person qualifies for extended health insurance coverage up until age 26, provided by the state of California, for example, public charge does not suddenly disqualify them. And then there are also privacy and confidentiality provisions. So benefits granting agencies cannot share information with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So people should feel safe using benefits they qualify for without fearing that utilizing benefits will lead to ICE deporting them. So where public charge comes into play is in the middle, this blue box. So it's not whether someone can use the benefit, the green box, or whether it makes them vulnerable to deportation, the red box, but really it's about how that use of certain public benefits might impact their immigration options. So if we could go to the next slide. So public charge isn't something new that this administration made up. It's existed in immigration law since the late 19th century, although the meaning of that term has changed over time. And basically, it's a reason a person could be denied admission to the United States or denied a green card. Other reasons include certain crimes or lying to an immigration official. So next slide. So an immigrant can be denied a visa or green card based on public charge if the immigration officer believes they're likely to rely upon the government for support in the future. So it's a prediction about the future made by looking at the applicant's current circumstances, including receipt of public benefits, but also a lot of other things like how old they are, their education and work history, etc. So next slide. So public charge does not apply to all immigrants. It only applies to those who are submitting certain immigration applications, mainly if the person is applying for a family or employer-sponsored green card. So it does not apply to non-citizens who are applying to renew their DACA, or refugees or asylees, victims of certain crimes through the U visa program, or victims of human trafficking through the T visa program, applicants for temporary protected status or TPS, and many others that we've listed out on this slide. So the note in the pink box is just that even though a person may currently be in a category where public charge doesn't apply, that doesn't mean that public charge will never apply to them. If a US citizen or a permanent resident, so like a green card holder, family member applies for them to get a green card, then at that point they may be subject to a public charge test. And so this is most applicable for people who have DACA or TPS because neither of those programs provides a direct pathway to getting a green card. So if someone with DACA or TPS is later applying for a green card through family, then they will in fact be subject to public charge at that point. By contrast, refugees and asylees, U and T visa holders, and special immigrant juveniles some of these other groups listed on the slide, they all have their own special pathway to getting a green card that doesn't involve a public charge test. In addition, so anyone who is undocumented and not planning to apply for an immigration application in the near future is not impacted by public charge, since number one, you have to be submitting an immigration application, and number two, it has to be an immigration application that involves a public charge test. Next slide. So the immigration law says that immigration officers must consider a multitude of factors when deciding whether someone seems at risk of being a public charge in the future. They're supposed to look at age, health, family size, financial resources, education, and skills. And no one factor can be dispositive. Next slide. So even though immigration officers are supposed to consider the applicant's age, health, etc., I'm sure as many of you are aware, a lot of people fixate on the use of public benefits that count, even though this really just relates to the applicant's financial situation, which is just part of this holistic analysis. So we've listed here the public benefits that count in a public charge test. So that means only use of these programs will be considered when they're evaluating whether someone's at risk of being a public charge. And then I just want to remind people again, though, that they're not just looking at use of public benefits. They're also looking at whether an applicant is very old or young, if they're employed, if they have a lot of family members to support, if they have health issues that may prevent them from working and supporting themselves, etc. So the benefits that count fall under four main categories: cash, nutrition, housing, and health. So for cash aid, this means programs like SSI, CalWORKS, which is California's TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, General Assistance, and CAPI. And so for nutrition, the only programs that count are food stamps, which in California we call CalFresh. So not any of the other nutrition programs like free and reduced school meals or PEBT, the pandemic EBT, those ones don't count. It's just CalFresh food stamps. And also it's only if the applicant is the one who is receiving the food stamps. So an undocumented parent might receive food stamps on behalf of a US citizen child, and that would not count towards public charge. And then so for housing, we're talking about Section 8 and federal public housing programs, but again, only if the applicant is the one who qualifies. So a family member might qualify for Section 8 housing and have other family members living with them under the same roof who do not qualify. And this also would not affect public charge. And then the way that the housing subsidy works is that it's actually adjusted to only cover the qualifying household members. And then finally for health programs, receipt of federally funded Medicaid counts, but there are a number of exceptions, which we've listed. I know it might be a little hard to read, but the exceptions are for emergency services, school-based benefits, use by children under age 21, and then in California, it's actually up until age 26, use during a pregnancy and up to 60 days after, and also any exclusively state-funded Medi-Cal services. So next slide. So the overlap between immigrants who qualify to receive the type of public benefits programs that count and immigrants who are subject to public charge is actually very small. Most immigrants who are seeking a visa or a green card are not eligible for those programs. Or if they are, it's because they're exempt from a public charge determination. For instance, refugees and asylees may qualify to receive some of the benefits listed on that last slide, but they're not subject to public charge, so they don't have to worry about it. Next slide. So there are actually a lot of public benefit programs that do not count. Some of these, although this isn't the full list, but some of these are listed on this slide. So it's okay for people to continue using these programs without any effect on public charge. And just to highlight a few, WIC doesn't count, Head Start doesn't count, Any earned benefits like unemployment, workers' compensation, Social Security retirement, tax credits, including the COVID-19 stimulus check, other disaster relief programs, including many local COVID relief programs. Next slide. So for immigrants who are applying for a green card or a visa and who are subject to public charge, the new public charge policies apply to them if they submitted their immigration application on or after February 24th, 2020, which is when the changes went into effect. So if they submitted their application earlier than that date, their case will be decided based on prior policy. So for the last 2 decades, proving a person was not likely to become a public charge primarily meant they had to show that a family member or other sponsor was promising to financially support them and had the financial resources to do so. And under prior policy, a public charge had to be primarily dependent on the government for subsistence, meaning they were living off of cash aid for income maintenance or living in long-term institutionalized care paid for by the government. So none of those housing, food, and health programs used to count. I also want to note, without getting too into the weeds, that a court order is currently blocking the new public charge policies from being applied, but only for cases decided at US consulates and embassies abroad. And this can include some people who are living in the United States, but who do not qualify to complete the application process within the United States. And then just to leave you all with some key takeaways, public charge does not apply to all immigrants or all public benefits programs, and it's also just not about public benefits. Since the Trump administration first announced plans to make these changes to public charge 2 years ago, we've seen a massive chilling effect in immigrants disenrolling from critical public benefits. So it's really important that we let people know that it doesn't apply to all immigrants or all programs, and that if they're not planning to submit an immigration application in the near future, then they don't need to be thinking about public charge. And then I guess just a note for some more resources. We've included some links to handouts by the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, where I work, and also Western Center for Law and Poverty and NILC, the National Immigration Law Center. And then I'd also recommend looking at the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. It's a coalition of advocates for immigrants, children, education, health, anti-hunger, and anti-poverty groups. And they're all sort of getting together around this issue of public charge, and they're releasing a lot of community resources. And then there's also a website, which I can put in the chat, called keepyourbenefitsca.org. That's also really helpful. That's it.
Thank you, Ariel.
Maria, you're on.
Yes, thank you, Ariel, for that, and thank you, Anna, for the introduction. My name is Maria Romani. I'm an immigrant rights policy attorney with the ACLU of Northern California. I'm actually based out of our Fresno office. I grew up in Fresno and moved here to do work, but I am focused around doing statewide work. And so I've been tasked to give a brief overview of what immigration detention looks like in California, what California is doing to protect its immigrant community, and what it could be doing more, especially given our current climate. So before I dive into the enforcement piece, I want to give an overview of what the detention landscape looks like in California. Next slide, please. So the map that you see outlines the 4 of the detention centers, but it's slightly outdated. There are actually 5 detention centers in California and 3 annexes that opened up this year. So in total, there are 8 facilities that hold immigrants in California. And all of those facilities, except for 1, are privately owned and operated. and there's actually active litigation around that now, and I'll go into that in a minute. But in total, these detention facilities hold or have the capacity to hold over 6,000 people. And just this past year in 2020, during a pandemic, the capacity to hold people in California increased by 50%. And that was actually due to active lobbying by these private corporations to open these facilities. At the moment, there are 3 facilities in the Central Valley, Mesa Verde, and its 2 annexes that just opened this year. And so, I give this just so, sometimes when we talk about detention, it's such an abstract thing, but, a lot of these centers, operate in impoverished regions of our state, and they take advantage of the fact that a lot of these regions depend on that kind of industry to be able to survive. And so I mentioned that because I want to talk about that at the end of my presentation in terms of opportunities. Next slide. And so last year, a coalition of folks worked to pass AB 32, which was a visionary law that went into effect this year. And what it does is it prohibits the California Department of Correction and Rehabilitation from entering into contracts or renewing contracts with these private prison companies. And so as of this year, they are prohibited from entering into new contracts or renewing contracts. And the hope is that by 2028, there will be no, both in the immigration context and in the criminal context, there will not be any privately owned or operated like carceral settings in California. But I mentioned this, sadly, there's active litigation now around AB 32 that we did get a really good decision at the trial level court, which is going to be appealed to the Ninth Circuit. But the really good decision at the trial court gives us a lot of hope for being able to keep this visionary AB 32 law in place so that we can kick out these private corporations that profit off the backs of our communities and lock up people when it's completely unnecessary. And we also have in California, because of litigation that happened many years ago, some telephonic access. So when you're in detention, and I mention this because some of you might have students who have parents in detention, and it's such a toll to be able to communicate with people when you're in detention. It's both, especially during a pandemic, but even prior to the pandemic, it's very difficult to get access, and then it's also very expensive. But because we, some of my colleagues filed a lawsuit many years ago, and they were able to settle it, and the settlement now provides telephonic access out of the Mesa Verde and Yuba detention facilities, which means basically that lawyers can actively reach out to their clients and set up meetings. And this is such a basic thing that should exist for everybody, but it does not. And it's only because of this settlement that these 2 detention facilities do actively provide access to communication, essentially. But it only exists in these 2 detention facilities out of the 8 in the state currently. Next slide. And so, in California, California really leads the vision and the path for limiting how our local law enforcement cooperates with ICE. And so 2 years ago, SC 54 went into effect. And what it does is it prohibits our local law enforcement, including school police, from entangling its resources to facilitate immigration enforcement. Some ways in which this prohibition occurs is that local law enforcement cannot ask people about their immigration status. It used to happen a lot, especially in rural communities, and now that's completely prohibited. They cannot hold somebody past their release time in their facilities in order to facilitate that person being picked up by ICE. they cannot transfer they cannot transfer somebody in their custody to ICE unless there are certain convictions that exist, and they cannot share non-public personal information with ICE. So these are all amazing limitations that have made a difference, but there are ways in which California can go further and should go further, and I think this pandemic has really illustrated how it can go further. And I'll touch base on that in a second. But I do want to celebrate what we do have, because it does make a difference in places like the Central Valley, where before this law, in a matter of 2 years, our sheriff had facilitated the transfer of over 500 people. And so because of this law, there's been a huge decrease in how many people end up in detention. We also have the Truth Act, which essentially, I think the biggest thing that the Truth Act does is that it allows for some transparency, because it requires local governing bodies to hold public forums to discuss the role local law enforcement had in immigration enforcement. So, a lot of the times during these forums, which are open to the public, people can give public comment. And at these forums, a lot of the times there's active data provided. And, obviously providing data is not enough. It's not going to change how enforcement is done, but it does allow for us to hold our electeds accountable. And so I want to say California is, I think, the only state, all other states have looked to create something like the Truth Act in their state, just so they can get access to basic data. It also, the Truth Act also requires people to be provided some level of notice when ICE is seeking to interview them or detain them. So in that way, it's also limited the active entanglement of enforcement in California. And I won't talk about AB 669 because Deb will do that, and so I'll let her share that expertise. Next slide. So I mentioned a few times California can go further. So this pandemic has really sharpened the ways in which there are ways in which our local law enforcement and our governor can do more. So for example, I mentioned that even though there are a lot of prohibitions that are offered under SC 54 and required under SC 54, there are still carve-outs, and there are still instances in which local law enforcement, if they want, can exercise their discretion and hand people over to ICE. And exercising that discretion is completely voluntary. And during this pandemic, when there have been studies upon studies showing that people in closed settings, like in carceral settings, like in detention settings, can actively get sick because of the virus, despite that data existing and that information existing, we still have local law enforcement and state CDCR staff transferring people totally voluntary, because these transfers are not required under the law. They're not required under any federal law, but they're actively transferring people who would otherwise be able to go home and shelter in place with their loved ones. They're transferring those people straight into detention centers. And so, at the beginning of this pandemic, we engaged in this statewide campaign to end those transfers, and we're still asking for an end to those transfers, because the governor can easily issue an order ending those transfers at a minimum during this pandemic. And so there are instances in which California can do more to limit ICE's presence in the state. And given where we are with the results of the election, I think a lot of states are going to look to California to see how it continues to pave the path. And I ask all of you to just actively be on the lookout for opportunities in which we can create a better California. I think a lot of people are doing a lot of soul searching. Organizations are doing soul searching and thinking through ways in which we lead with our values and stop leaving people out. And really fight for a state that really embraces immigrants equally and does not carve out instances in which certain people will not be protected. And so the very last thing I'll share is the next slide, please. Next slide. Even though we have seen a decrease in enforcement during this pandemic, and we hope there continues to be less enforcement during the Biden administration, to the extent that that you or your students experience any sort of ICE enforcement, there are a lot of networks in place, and I'm just going to leave that link there. That provides numbers for different networks throughout the state that can connect you with resources or hopefully an attorney that can help in responding to an emergency. So I end it there because I want to be cognizant of time. Thank you.
Okay.
Welcome, Deborah.
I don't know where I am. Okay, I have 4 minutes that I've been told I have 4 minutes. That's all I have. So I'm not going to be my usual interesting and witty self, but I'm going to talk about AB 699, which really kind of codifies the Plyler versus Doe decision and guarantees any student, regardless of your immigration status, the right to attend public school. Next, please. So the past 2.5, next slide, please. The last 2.5 years, I've been investigating school districts to see to what extent they've been complying with AB 699. There are 2 issues I want to raise. There's a whole list of requirements. I can't get into all of them right now, not in 4 minutes, but I just want to mention 2 of them. School boards must inform parents about their children's right to attend school regardless of immigration status. And also you have to have policies in place to limit immigration enforcement in our schools. And the Attorney General already has a model policy. You have to have either adopt his or an equivalent policy. In terms of all other policies you have to change, like your anti-discrimination policies and things like that, or your enrollment policies. CSBA has done the work for you. Just contact them. They've done an extensive job. There's a lot of policies to be amended. No excuses. The next issue is the notice to parents about their right for children to attend school regardless of their immigration status. You can put that in your annual parent notice, but I have found that that notice has gotten like to be 30 pages. And sometimes the immigrant rights notice is like buried in the middle of it. I don't know how any parent reads these, especially those who are immigrant. So anyway, if we can somehow maybe get that policy posted differently on your website or mailed to parents, that would be a good thing. So I've mentioned that I have been investigating school districts. I think I've been to school districts, their websites of school districts in every county in California. I have filed complaints with the Attorney General's office, and they accept them and they eventually investigate it. It takes them a while, but I have named 421 school districts in non-compliance with AB 699. So far, I've been able to see that 163 have changed their policies. I've also filed 37 separate UCP complaints against school districts for non-compliance with AB 699. These are the 4 of them, 4 compliance issues that I focus on. Some school districts, believe it or not, still ask, as we speak, U.S. citizen, yes, no on their enrollment forms. That's a big no-no. One school district asked it on their English, did not ask it on their English form, but asked it on their Spanish form. Social Security numbers, Education Code 49076.7b, those things unless required by state or federal law. You may need that in terms of free or reduced lunch, but the AG doesn't want you to ask about that during the enrollment process. And you have to inform parents that it's not necessary for them to provide that information. Date of entry, and by the way, if you have Social Security number, ? And you put optional, that's not enough. You have to take it off your enrollment form. Date of entry into the US, this is a big time non-compliance issue. School districts think that they have to ask this for Title III purposes to see whether or not a student falls within the definition of immigrant student under Title III. That's not true. In fact, the federal government, at least I don't think it's been rescinded yet, has specifically told districts they should not ask that question. I often fight date of entry on the home language survey. The AG, by the way, thinks it's okay to ask this question. I don't think it's okay to ask that question at all. Then proof of age, this is a big one. Education Code section 48002 has a whole list of what you can bring in terms of proving, what a parent can bring in terms of proof their child's age. What I normally find is that school districts say birth certificate or passport. Sometimes they have different things and they say, oh, and by the way, it has to be translated into English. The code doesn't say that. There's a whole list of alternatives that the code lists. And then it says at the end, an affidavit of the parent, guardian, or custodian of the minor, or any other appropriate means of proving the age of the child as prescribed by the governing board of the school district. Many times what I find is that a school district's board policy and their administrative regulation is compliance with with Education Code Section 48002. But what they're telling parents on their web pages is not consistent with their own policies. That's the big issue, major issue. Then we have the online ARIES process. A lot of school districts are going down this path. You have to make sure that what you're instructing parents or what you're asking in the ARIES process is also compliant with AB 699. You need to know what is on your enrollment forms. Some school districts tell me, well, we didn't know we were asking this. I go, how do you not know what's on your enrollment form? How do you not know this? And then we have to now ask ourselves, I thought I was somewhat patronizing in terms of this issue. Do immigrant parents actually have access to the internet? Well, apparently not. EdSource just reported that hundreds of thousands of California students do not have internet access. We need alternatives to online enrollments. We need a different way of telling parents how you can enroll your child. I've been an attorney for, I almost said 40, but I'll say 35. And I've been through websites, and sometimes I can't find an enrollment process on a school district's website. And then the next, please. Next issue, next slide. At least I thought I had one. There is a translation issue with ARIES. What I have found is that sometimes you can maybe press Spanish version, and what happens is that the actual.
Okay, it appears we're having some technical difficulties. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up this section. Apologize for the technical difficulties. Sometimes, it's one of the things that we've all been experiencing, right? The pandemic and distance learning that, it doesn't always go the way we'd like it to. So we want to, thank you, Deborah, for your presentation. We would love to hear you more, and we will certainly soak up all of the information you've shared. And I just want to echo that your work is just so very, very valuable, all of you. Thank you so much for this, the incredible information and the work that you're doing on behalf of immigrants for their rights. We are going to consolidate breakout room 1 with breakout room 2. So just for the sake of time, and we'll kind of process both this presentation and the next one together in our next breakout. So we're going to take a little 1-minute break, and we're going to just kind of stretch and just, if you need to go to the restroom, grab some water. We're gonna just take a little 1-minute break, and then we're gonna begin our panel at 2:03. So we'll begin our panel at 2:03, so 1-minute break, and let's just take that breathing break and whatever we need in 1 minute. We're going to be beginning now with our panel. I hope you guys had a little stretch break and ability to move forward. We have 4 people that I would like to introduce on our panel today. Let's see. Manuel, we're going to begin to spotlight our individuals. So today we have with us Erendira Medina. Erendira Medina is a parent of 1 school-age son and a recent graduate of Project to Inspire, which is a project of California Association for Bilingual Education. Project to Inspire aims to develop parent and family leadership, build family, school, and community partnerships, and so that students can reach their fullest potential academically, emotionally, and personally. Erendira will be responding to questions in Spanish today, and we will be using a closed caption feature or our chat room to share English translation of her responses. If you would like to, well, actually, let me just double check here. Crystal, are we going to have the closed caption available for this session?
Yeah, so if you go to the toolbar, you'll see an option right next to your chat called closed captioning. If you click the arrow, you'll be able to see the full transcript of the translations.
Okay. And we also have with us today Ellie Leon. Ellie Leon is a student from Portola High School in Irvine. She's a member of the California Association of Student Councils and the California Student Advisory Board for Education. Ellie recently presented a report on racial equity to the State Board of Education, highlighting the group's research and recommendations to inform policy and practice in California schools. With us today, we also have Tom Felix. Tom Felix is the Director of Newcomers at and the ELL programs for Oakland Unified School District. Tom is a Bay Area native who's been working in the Oakland Public Schools for nearly 20 years as a middle school teacher, a teacher on special assignment, a principal, and a district administrator. So we welcome Tom. We also have Carolina Scheinfeld. Carolina is an immigration relations coordinator from the Los Angeles County Office of Education. Carolina brings years of experience directly and indirectly bettering the lives of asylum seekers, refugees, and other immigrant communities. From the Los Angeles County Office of Education, she's been empowering the 80 school districts in LA County with programs that create safe and welcoming learning environments. Welcome, Carolina. So I'll begin our questions with highlighting our first two panelists. And we have Ellie and Edwina. Hi, Ellie.
Hi.
Ellie, could you please tell us what it's been like for you and other immigrant students and families in your school and community? And from your research, have you found that other students have had similar experiences?
Yeah, so I live in Orange County, which is already a pretty diverse community with like a large Asian group, but even still, I've had my fair share of like racist encounters. Personally, this March, sorry, I've had students joke about staying 6 feet away from me because I'm Chinese American and, you know, they didn't want to contract COVID-19. And I've heard stories in Tesoro High School where a teacher called a Black girl a monkey and no school administration took action. And in Annalee High School, a student of color was told by educators she had little to no chance to attend college despite her strong academic performance. And this is only a small sample of scenarios that I've heard. And I feel like a lot of people regard racism when it's only upfront and blunt, like racial slurs, but there's so many more racially charged incidents that fall under the category of microaggressions. And like these small jabs at our identity make us feel like we have to internalize them. And so we try to throw away parts of our identity in order to assimilate in school culture because we don't feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, in schools, there are often people who are seen as the trusted messengers or structures or systems in place that support to be responsive to the needs, and such as you had, or also to value the assets of those diverse communities. So Ellie, you know, particularly with the experiences that you've had or that you've seen with acts of racism or trauma, what does this look like for your school? And what does the research that you do, you know, what did you find in your research? Is it similar to other schools?
Yeah, so during our research, I found 3 of what I would consider to be the most important systems that are in place. The first one is AB 9, also known as SETS law, which is a legislation passed in 2011 that requires the state superintendent to provide anti-discrimination resources for LEAs, intervention from school staff who witness acts of racism, and student accessibility to procedures and policies for handling discrimination. The second are disciplinary actions that are taken through a restorative justice lens, like student mediation, peer courts, counseling. And the third are anonymous tip lines, forms, or any way students can comfortably report these incidences. But unfortunately, I will admit my school has none of these besides AB9, but that's like holistically. So that's why, and I know a lot of other schools don't either, because school administration don't really take this issue seriously. So I think that's why it's so vital to start implementing these sort of systems so that students can learn comfortably.
Thank you so much, Ellie. And, you know, and I know across the board, you know, when I was a teacher and a school administrator, I also experienced that people weren't aware of, you know, those rights, or if there was a policy in place, how their district was handling it. So we really encourage people to you know, pay attention and look and see what's in your district. Someone you know probably wrote that policy, and you could enforce it, you know, help them enforce it or implement it. So we're going to come back to you in a minute, Ellie. Next, the question I have is for Erendira. Erendira, it's a similar question. Is going to be about trusted messengers. Erendira, en cada comunidad te encuentras a personas quienes son vistas como los mensajeros de la confianza para las familias de inmigrantes. ¿Quiénes son esas personas? ¿Y cuál es el papel que desempeñan?
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Erendira. Por medio del proyecto Inspirit 2 y Mari, gracias a ellos por darnos tan valiosa información a todos nosotros los inmigrantes que podemos ayudarnos en estos tiempos difíciles. La información que yo he recibido es buscar recursos financieros y apoyo socioemocional. Muchas gracias a ellos, porque existen estos ángeles que nos ayudan a todos los inmigrantes a salir adelante y cómo hacer las cosas para que todos salgamos beneficiados.
Gracias, Erendira. So let's move on to the county or the district level. Tom, what is your role in supporting immigrant and refugee students in your district?
Yeah,
and also, what are some of the trusted messengers that you have?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. So I'm responsible for supporting an array of initiatives within the district that are focused on recent immigrant students who we refer to frequently as newcomers. And so that responsibility is kind of divided into some instructional areas and some supportive services. So we, in kind of preparing for this, ended up dwelling a little bit on the supportive services. So we have a team of newcomer social workers that work across our middle and high schools with newcomer programs. We operate an intake center that is sort of parallel to the main student intake center that focuses on addressing the needs of immigrant students and their families and screening them and making appropriate referrals. We have quite a bit of infrastructure in place to support legal referrals, so that if families make it known to us that they are concerned about their immigration status and any legal ramifications there, that we're prepared to refer them for help. And we also support a number of community navigators to provide interpretation. MUM, which is Mayan dialect or language from Guatemala, is very prevalent in Oakland, and lots of interpretation needs exist. And then on the instructional side, we have a lot of professional development and other resources that we are continually iterating to help support our teachers in meeting the challenges of the work in front of them. And I think that, you know, the trusted messengers, it's you know, we've obviously tried to create positions where we can bring those trusted messengers. So the social workers I referenced, as they become more established in schools, absolutely become those. Often it's a particular teacher within a school who may become that trusted messenger. And of course, we can try to hire the best people, but we can't always choose who our families trust. So some of our work is also in making sure that where people emerge as that trusted messenger, that we're supporting them with the information and the resources that they need to be responsive to the families.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. And Carolina, you're working at the county level, you know, and so the same question, you know, what is your role in supporting the immigrant students at the county level? And Carolina, what are the systems of support or, you know, the trusted messengers that you have at that level that are responsive to the needs? and also, value the assets of our immigrant students.
Thank you, Ruth. So similar to Tom, I think there are two clear areas in terms of professional development, and then the other one that is supportive services. I come to LACO from the nonprofit side, so that allowed me also to bring in that network of legal and social service providers with whom I used to work and have a different understanding, though I still struggle with the education system and with the county that is so large and with 80 school districts being just a one-person program. So very jealous of Oakland and a full team. But in my role, so supporting, yes, it's supporting the districts, but also ultimately to support the student and the families. And I'm able to use a number of existing channels that LACO already had through the newcomer programs, student support services, migrant ed, nutrition services, so many other like hubs that already existed within LACO that had been providing support to students. So like, how do I come in and then help them understand changes in policies, help them also connect with organizations that are provided supportive services, complementary services, and then also, in a time of so much division, how can we build better partnerships? So like looking at that and looking at, and also the communications part. So try to make sure we have resources that are accessible to our students and their families, and meeting them where they need to be. So those are some of the things. And in terms of trusted messengers, and I don't want to jump into too much right now, like into a different area, but I think this time, COVID and like the stay at home orders and being together apart has shown us the importance of supporting families, like the parents and or custodians in case of our unaccompanied minors that are with our family members. So I think trusted messengers being the families, like not just, and yes, the schools are the center of the communities, but how are the schools then supporting those families so that then they can also spread the message with their neighbors, with their family members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Carolina. And that is such an important piece of it too, right? Is that people are sharing, then, they may get information, they may be sharing it with others. Ellie, I'm going to come back to you now. It is clear that you've learned a lot about schools and communities and how they've met challenges and become stronger over the last year. Were there any specific resources that were shared with you or that you found to be particularly helpful, and what you think others might like to learn about?
Yes. Once again, to reiterate my previous point, a lot of the resources I discovered were singular clubs and people or systems that a particular school sets up individually. So none of these resources extend to the entirety of our state. And for that very reason, it's especially in terms of student support, it's really hard for all students of California to find help. But of course, if anything ever happens, my contact information is here. Anyone can shoot me a message at any time, and I'll try to connect you with people that I think can help.
Thank you so much, Shelley. It's just amazing, what a resource, you are for your peers and now, for all of those on this call that may like some support in that area. I'm going to move over to Erendira again. Erendira, usted ha mencionado, I'm going to be asking her to give an example of something that she has experienced, some information. Usted ha mencionado información que has recibido que te ha ayudado a enfrentar estos tiempos tan difíciles. ¿Nos podrías dar un ejemplo de lo que has aprendido en esos tiempos que te ha ayudado a ti?
Sí, a mí la pandemia me ha afectado mucho en todo lo que es mis ingresos, y no poder ayudar a otras personas. Pero gracias al proyecto Inspire, que ellos me han dado la información para poder aplicar ayuda para la ayuda financiera que estaban dándole a todos los inmigrantes. Yo apliqué, en el momento me dijeron que ya había pasado la fecha límite y me dijeron que tenía que esperarme. A las 2 horas yo ya esperé y me llamaron, me dijeron que ya había sido calificada para recibir la ayuda. No solamente yo me beneficié con esa ayuda que me dieron, también se beneficiaron a amigos, familiares, porque la información que mismo me dio Project Spirit 2, yo misma se las pasé a ellos para que ellos recibieran la misma ayuda que todos los inmigrantes tenemos derecho en ese país.
Gracias, Arendira. Y eso es muy bonito también, como estábamos hablando hace un momentito, de que recibió la información y luego lo compartió de más. So multiplica los esfuerzos, ¿verdad? So I was just saying that, it's really beautiful how, she was able to get information and then share it with others in her, family and people that are around in her world. And so what we do often multiplies, and really reinforcing that topic of the fact that you've got a program in place like Project to Inspire, and without that program, she wouldn't have had that information. So it's really, wonderful that she can share that. So I'm going to go back to Tom now. Tom is talking about information. Were there any specific information or tools or resources that you found to be particularly helpful during this difficult time, with the school closures and the pandemic and meeting the needs of this population?
Yeah, thank you. The challenge here is that, as you gave me a heads up to think about this question, we find that it's really challenging for us to create any one sort of written resource or tool that is actually going to address the needs adequately of the families that we are working to support. And so, my answer would be that it is actually through these trusted messengers and through these relationships that we begin to understand what needs exist and then respond appropriately. And it often may be that at the time of intake, one relatively simple need is evident and we attempt to address that. And then in so doing, we find out about all of these other things. So it may start out just about a bus pass and then turn into a whole range of things that we uncover. And if we had just said, here's a brochure about how to get a bus pass, we would have missed all of these opportunities. So it's certainly more labor intensive, but I would say that it's also more effective. So, I mean, with that said, in the time of the pandemic and school closures, as was noted at the beginning of this session, our immigrant students and families are feeling the most acute economic pain and the greatest risk of exposure to the virus. And cash relief and financial assistance has turned into like this enormous body of work for the team of people that support these families, and as well as connecting people to resources such as pandemic EBT. But there's a kind of a large network of philanthropic support for immigrant families in our community, but actually getting those dollars into the hands of families is actually quite complicated for both logistically and for some legal reasons involving moving a lot of money around. So, I'd say, unfortunately, the work is very individualized because it does take that relationship building to really get to the heart of what sorts of needs are there. I also just want to re-emphasize what Carolina said, which is that the community partners are also essential trusted messengers. And like we would be nowhere near where we are without a number of community partners with whom we work. Because if they're the trusted messengers and they can carry the message that we're trying to get across, then that's all that, really matters.
And Tom, it's interesting, you're really hitting home on something that's really important about that case management, right? And the needs of the individuals. And in thinking about, like the information that Arendira shared, she shared that, when she called to try to get support, they said it was past the deadline and she couldn't get it. And then 2 hours later, she got a call. So are you finding that, when people are working with the students or families or, to try to get help, that sometimes, those little tips on, well, stay the course or whatever is something that you wouldn't know if you didn't do case management?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And a term that I've learned that I didn't know until I was working with a team of social workers is just accompaniment, like how much actually having somebody who is familiar with our bureaucracies and our institutions accompany families, just so that they, maybe to encourage them to assert themselves or persist in settings where they may not be familiar with how to go about that, just for lack of exposure to these bureaucracies. You know, so absolutely. You know, again, it looks different every time, but a lot of it is just having members of our staff be pushy, either like encouraging families to be pushy or being pushy themselves on behalf of our families and our students.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. And it's important to recognize that it's not just a pamphlet, right? That is giving people information, although that could be a step into a relationship with someone to help them. So I'm going to move to Carolina now. Carolina, same question. You know, were there any specific tools or resources that you think, you know, would be important to highlight today to share?
Well, a number of them. I think I would begin, and I'm going to put it in the chat, like the governor's office used to be a brochure, now it's a website, like the Guide for Immigrant Californians. And I think this is I forget who mentioned this, but like the leading with our values comment on how California is being called to do this. I think this is an important reminder on how, you know, these materials, and like through the COVID crisis, like we've been trying to, or like the state has been trying to address all Californians, so like regardless of immigration status, and then like going through that resource book, like how some resources are there. Also, I think the California Department of Social Services has been moving things around, like through what first started, you know, as like One California funding for unaccompanied minors, who now also are providing legal support for people that have worries around public charge and accessing public benefits. Participating in existing networks that I used to be part of when I was at Legal Aid, so like the Unaccompanied Minors Collaborative here in Southern California, refugee forums, and others that bring the day-to-day operations, also reality to my work, that while I'm trying to support the school districts, I also understand, you know, some of the challenges that they are facing, and try to contribute also with the knowledge I had, also in exploring the possibility of designing new programs and others. The Protecting Immigrant Families campaign that was mentioned also before by the previous panel, I think that has been key, the amount of resources, and then the partnerships that we've been able to develop through that group. Here in California, there's a Protecting Immigrant Families chapter of the state, and then through like different agencies like the Children's Partnership. I think Nancy, hi Nancy, you're here, and Araceli and others have been collaborating with LACO specifically in developing then content that we're giving to families and to teachers. So we have different, you know, the community facing ones, and then the training for trainers around public charge in English and Spanish, and yeah, so I think having supporting services for us as well as providers has been key. So not just learning of all the changes, but also knowing where to go to to continue to build our resilience. One more resource I'll put in the chat is something that our Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program developed, and since our session today is based around resilience, so it's a full guide on resources for wellness. So, and this one, I think, yes. So this one has, you know, from sounds of relaxation, guided meditation, and others. But I think that's also important, like acknowledging that this batch of burnout is no longer, you know, cool, and that, you know, while we are here to care for others, we also need to remember to take care of ourselves, because that's what these times are calling for. So
that sounds like a lesson learned.
Yes, by personal experience. I have a 3-year-old, so I can share. I like crashed this summer, so and I saw so many parents also in the same boat. So kudos to you.
Do you have any other lessons learned or silver linings from this experience?
The importance of acknowledging parents, I think, and having spaces for parents, like we were talking about, you know, and how quickly schools responded in terms of, you know, like it was like a humanitarian response in terms of like the grab and go sites, how quickly they, you know, not turn around from Friday to Monday, they had to have food ready, and then also make sure they have equipment. And we were talking about this, like bridging the digital divide for students, but it's also bridging the digital divide for parents. So like how quickly we had to, you know, some districts developed tools on to share, like how to set up a Zoom account, how to use Google Meet, etc. So I think those are, you know, how quickly everybody responded, and how now there might be more access than before in certain areas. While we're still struggling, I think it's important to acknowledge that some wins have happened.
Yeah, you know, we heard along the lines of technology, a lot of parents, and Erendira talked about learning about technology through Project to Inspire as well. And you know, parents that were learning how to Zoom as their kids were learning, and then they would get on their ELAC meetings or their DLAC meetings, and you know, traditionally maybe they had a tiny number of people at those calls, and then now that parents could access, they had the largest numbers ever participating in some communities. So, you know, again, that was definitely a silver lining. Tom, do you have anything to add? You know, anything you learned from this experience or any silver linings in this
Yeah,
process?
you just you took some of the words out of my mouth, right? Like there have been some venues for parent engagement, and actually engagement, I'd say across our system, including employees, where it has been easier to get people to show up. But I think the other thing I'd say is a little bit more meta, which is, you know, it's been said so many times how much the pandemic has exposed the inequities in our society, right? And I think everyone who's on this call, I would bet, already understood that there are some deep inequities around how, as a society, we support and uplift our immigrant communities. But I will, if there has to be a silver lining, the fact that more people are focused on it and talking about it, I think is valuable. And within our school district, that has meant some real emphasis on, like, we've gone from grab and go to food delivery and prioritizing newcomer families with food delivery. We've had philanthropic support for like internet hotspots and Chromebooks and prioritizing our newcomer families for that. So I think, you know, in my 5 years in this position, I feel like I've gone from sort of like knocking on doors and begging to having people sort of acknowledge that this needs to be a focus, and how can we focus our supports and resources here. So if we are able to keep that after the pandemic, then that will definitely be a silver lining.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tom, for sharing that. I'd like to move now back to Erendira. Erendira, you know, I have a question for her about what she's learned in the process and what she may have been inspired or motivated to do in the future. So, Erendira, considerando tus experiencias durante la pandemia y todo lo que has aprendido durante el proceso, ¿te has motivado o inspirado a hacer algo diferente o nuevo para el futuro?
Claro que sí, me he motivado, me he inspirado muchísimo. Lo primero que yo quiero hacer es aprender el idioma inglés, y después para poderme inscribir al colegio y poder tomar unos cursos de superación personal para mi persona, para poder ayudar a mi hijo, sus estudios, a la gente. Yo he aprendido mucho porque he aprendido también a manejar lo que es Zoom. Yo no sabía nada de la computación, nada de la tecnología. Gracias a este proyecto al que yo estoy, he aprendido muchísimo a manejar todo, cómo es todo lo que viene siendo cómo se maneja Zoom, cómo pedir ayuda para todos nosotros. Yo le agradezco a todas mis compañeras del programa, del proyecto Inspire, por todo el apoyo que nos han dado a todos nosotros, que hemos seguido adelante. Y pues yo quiero aprender muchísimo y quiero seguir adelante para seguir siendo parte del proyecto Inspire 2.
Thank you, Erendira. You are, usted es una inspiración para mí, para muchos, me imagino. Gracias por compartir. So Ellie, I'm going to give you the final note on the panel with the last question here. Considering what you've learned from your research and your experience, What recommendations do you have for school leaders or policymakers, or is there anything else that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so while I attended the Student Advisory Board on Education, my group and I constructed a proposal. Here, let me paste the link to the document so maybe you guys can,
We've got it in.
maybe you guys can follow along or read it later. Doesn't really matter. So our recommendation essentially is for Superintendent Thurman to instruct the Task Force on Safe Schools, which is already an existing task force, to design a blueprint of practices for reporting incidents of racism and complete subsequent research to formulate this model. We also suggest holding surveys for students in regards to this model, as well as including student representatives so that all stakeholders, including students, are represented in this task force. And so after development is complete, Superintendent Thurman will distribute it to school districts and local educational agencies, along with the other resources he has to provide under AB 9. And I know that was a big mouthful of words, but essentially what we're advocating for is just easy ways for students to report these incidences, for student administration to follow up and deliver consequences under restorative justice practices.
Wonderful. Well, that is just fabulous. And you know, you and your peers have just done incredible work in finding that and giving those recommendations. And I will support them. And I hope that all the people on the call, you know, will also support those efforts. So again, thank you to all of our incredible panelists. You've enlightened us, you've provided information and so many resources. And so we're gonna break out while it's all hot in our head and our minds and in our thoughts. We're going to break out into random breakout rooms, and we have a couple of questions we'd like you to consider in those breakout rooms. So considering, you know, the day so far, what's resonated with you from these speakers, and what does it look like in your community, and what implications might there be for your work, or your school or community? So you know, just think about what you've heard. As I said, we're going to be breaking out. We're going to have a 12-minute breakout session, and then we'll see you back here. So you'll have an invitation, you'll be sent to a room.
So it's really my, just one second. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andres Shola, who is a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science at UC Davis. He is a general adult psychiatrist providing holistic, trauma-informed, patient-centered, culturally responsive psychiatric care. He has a special expertise in providing culturally responsive care to members of ethnic and cultural minorities, including immigrants. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shola.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me today to this presentation. This is going to be focusing on the feelings of welcoming and inclusivity. So the title of the presentation is Trauma and Resilience Informed Approaches when Working with Immigrant and Refugee Students. Trauma and resilience as really are two sides of the same coin. It took me a while to understand that. I actually started my professional life in trauma very near the border with Mexico, the south of San Diego in San Isidro, when I took over a clinic of mostly Mexican immigrants, and I provided services there, and I realized the role that trauma in all the manifestations was playing in the lives of my patients and their health. So trauma-informed care is something that has been evolving for a few decades, started probably in the 80s with psychiatrists actually that were providing psychiatric care to women, mostly African-American women, for whom trauma was a daily occurrence practically, very normative, nearly universal for most of them. And many of them were in a homeless situation, Many of them were using substances. And so they, the psychiatrists and other clinicians that were taking care of them realized that the new approach was different. And we'll talk more about that. But I want to present here in this slide the definition of trauma-informed care adapted to school system, because I know that many of you, or perhaps most of you, are related to education. And I think that there's a very easy transition between trauma-informed care to trauma-informed education, if you will. So a school system is trauma-informed when it realizes the widespread impact of trauma. So there's a knowledge component to this. Then recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma, because the signs and symptoms of trauma are not clear all the time. They can be indirect. Just to give an example from from medicine, many people that present with physical symptoms really are behind that physical symptom presentation is trauma history. The third R is response by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practice. So this is an institutional component to this definition. And finally, everybody gets together, providers, teachers, whoever, and the society actually, and the system of care, or in this case, school, to resist re-traumatization. It's very important to realize that in our daily business, we can sometimes, without wanting to, re-traumatize individuals. So this is another element of the 4 R's of the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration definition. They also came up with these principles of safety. And I want you to think right off the bat, while we're talking about this, how the safety may look very different, the sense of safety, very different from a patient in my settings, for example, from a youth or a child with a history of immigration or a refugee status. What does safety mean for them? Trustworthiness and transparency, peer support. And so you have to think that these were conceived for adult patients. So you need to start to think about how these principles may be modified or adapted to work with children and youth. So my own revision for patients, but also I think is equally important for working with in educational settings, is build on strengths, enhance resilience. And this is something that's, as I told you before, took me a while to realize that a key to address trauma is really building resilience. So another way of looking at trauma-informed care is through this pyramid that was developed by Sheila Raja at the University of Chicago at Illinois. And the key concept here I want to emphasize is what she called trauma universal precautions. Some of you may be aware that in the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic started, healthcare providers developed this concept of universal precautions, assuming that anybody who came into a clinical setting, a hospital, a clinic, could be a carrier or HIV infection. So you have to take some precautions and treat everybody as if they were infected. By the same token, this trauma universal precautions is considering that anybody who enters into your agency, your service agency, your school, what have you, may be exposed to trauma. And so the two pillars of this pyramid are patient-centered communication skills as applied to medical care and understanding the health effects of trauma. We will not have time now to go into that, but I want to tell you that this is an important concept, and you will have the slides at the end of the presentation if you want to go from here and take it to the next level. So in the field of trauma-informed care, this is a famous quote by one of the pioneers that goes from our program director, Sadie Best, when he observed that we had stopped asking the fundamental question, what's wrong with you? and change it to what has happened to you. And this mantra, what's wrong with you, changing to what's happened to you, is very well known. And I hope that you immediately will grasp the importance of going from this position of judgment and detachment. Remember, there's this clinicians used to try to find what's wrong with people, to a position of curiosity, open-mindedness, and compassion. What has happened to you? How can I understand what you're expressing here through knowing more about your background, your context, your personal history? Now, a little bit about a word about traumas. In the field, we talk about big T traumas and little t traumas. And I propose to you that most of the traumas that we're exposed to are actually little t traumas, like the bulk of an iceberg that is invisible. So some of the little t traumas that we very often overlook are things like structural inequities, stemming from intersecting isms and phobias, such as government-sponsored displacement, exclusion and segregation, public charge rule and DACA rescission, laws that don't protect same-sex couples. So these are, I could have also listed there, systemic racism. These are things that are affecting us with little t's. And I will tell you again a little bit later why this is important, nevertheless, even though they are little t. And another example, macro and microaggressions based on race, ethnicity, national origin, social class, gender expression, sexual orientation, or religion, among others. And the importance of this is that it doesn't matter whether you have an exposure to a big T trauma or little t trauma, it all translates ultimately in the body to what we call the stress response, how the body survives. We have a system in our bodies that triggers an alarm and deploys all these chemicals in the body, stress hormones, that promote body-wide changes. And those body-wide changes prepare us for fight, flight, and one third option that I want you to be thinking about. So the changes that we're having in our bodies are like dilated pupils, trembling, pale or flushed skin, rapid heart beating, and breathing. So the third F is freeze. So you have here a possum playing possum. So we all have the capacity to play dead to escape danger. So sometimes some victims of trauma do not react with a typical fight or flight, but they get paralyzed. And they can be a source of great distress to them because they wonder later why I didn't say anything, why I didn't scream, why didn't I fight back? And because it's there's a bodily response that gets deployed instantaneously. Now, changing a little bit the shift and the angle to these, let's talk about stress, because we're talking about how stress is the stress response system secondary to trauma. Is stress ever good? Actually, yes, we have positive stress, tolerable stress, and toxic stress. And without going too much into the details of what constitutes toxic stress, think about, many of you, I imagine, are familiar with this concept of a comfort zone, a learning zone, and a terror or panic zone. When we learn when we step out of our comfort zone and experience a positive stress, if you will, that sharpens our attention, increases our learning, before we go into a place where we feel uncomfortable, too challenged, which triggers our insecurities or stereotype threat or whatever it is. So we have to be in that learning zone. And so we can reverse toxic, make it tolerable or even positive. And there's a whole literature now that is established very clearly that children that are exposed to very severe adversity, abuse, maltreatment, neglect, it takes one person, one adult that is committed to the well-being of the child, that is able to buffer that stress, and that child will have a different course in their life, a different trajectory, thanks to the presence of that coach or teacher or a relative or a friend. Many people can play that role. So educators can create a very important place in their classrooms by helping children and youth regulate their emotions, so to bring from the panic zone back to the learning zone, or for those who are in the comfort zone to move them into the learning zone by challenging them and presenting problems or issues that are within their scope of learning but are not too challenging. So emotional regulation is something very important for us. Now, there's also post-traumatic growth. So you have in this graph a representation of what can happen after, in time, after a traumatic event in which you have a rapid decline in the level of functioning. And you can have the lowest, when you decrease your level of functioning, you have two main negative outcomes, which are post-traumatic stress, when you have survival with impairment or completely succumbing to trauma. But also you have resilience. You go back to your baseline, if you will. However, very often, depending on the circumstances, people can actually thrive after trauma, and it's what is called post-traumatic growth. So what do I mean by resilience? So resilience can be, that has multiple definitions, one of which is taken from Wikipedia here, is the ability to cope with a crisis, to return to pre-crisis status quickly. And this is an ability of an individual. Now, there's also another definition by the American Psychological Association that says it's a process, actually, not the ability of an individual, but a process of adapting well in the face of adversity. So an interaction between an individual and their environment. Now, we have a third definition that is more holistic, that says that is the capacity of a dynamic, adaptive system to adapt successfully to disturbances that threaten the viability, the function, or the development of that system. And this is by Maston, one of the leaders in the field of resilience research. So I do not mean, when I talk about resilience, an individual resilience, because this is very often a representation of resilience. A quick change with a clipping with the scissors, I can't, you clip the T and you say, I can do it, with an emphasis in the person, I can. But I want to challenge you guys to consider actually individual resilience at the bottom of the screen within concentric circles, domains of resilience, including household resilience, family, neighborhood, community, and societal resilience. So in this representation, taken from this study, the reference of which is at the bottom, the figure locates individual resilience within overlapping and interrelated dynamic domains of resilience. And it recognizes that each domain of resilience contributes to and potentially can detract from the other domains. Now, I want to close by quickly going over a very new model that is even more ambitious in scope, in my opinion, because they start in the Empower Action model with this socio-ecological model. That is what the previous model was. This is socio-ecological perspective. So here we have a public policy, community organization, interpersonal, family, individual resilience, and this is actually encircled by a second domain of protective factors, like build resilience through learning skills needed to manage stress and nurture children, create positive environments, growth positive outcomes by promoting individual development, share resources that allow individuals and families to meet their basic needs, and support individuals and families through positive relationships. So you have the original core, if you will, of the socioecological model of this interacting domains of resilience with these protective factors, and then you add a third layer, if you will, that is race equity and inclusion. So you create, and the strategies for that are create an inclusive environment for all families, encourage a strong cultural identity for all families, demonstrate a commitment to equity and inclusion in policies and practices. And last but not least, this through a life course perspective. So it's not static, it goes from childhood throughout the life's course. So I'm going to skip these slides just to let you know that I have listed additional resources for you all. And I want to signal the organizers now that I'm ready to go into breakout rooms, and then we'll follow that with Q&As.
Yeah, so again, we're going to have you go to breakout rooms, and this time you may be focused on, the content from Dr. Shola and what it resonates with you. And also, if you have some questions for him, he's going to take a question and answer after this. So it's a very wonderful opportunity to have him with us. So we'll be moving to our breakout rooms now. Okay, they're coming back.
Everybody should be back by now.
All right.
So welcome back, everyone. I'm here to answer your questions. Not to put too much pressure on you all, but I have to go at, in 8 minutes. So don't be shy, please, and either speak up, or I don't know, the protocol is for them to put in the chat, or people can unmute themselves.
They can do either, yeah.
All right. I'm all ears.
Okay, I'll take a stab. Hi, thank you so much. So within our group, so we talked about, so thank you to Lucy and Romy who were there with me. We're talking about how we appreciated even the title of your presentation, like saying, how to welcome students, and seeing the importance of this time on how, having like a caring-based approach, and like assuming that everybody needs the help, not that it's only going to be specific groups of immigrant students as impacted by traumatic events, but like everybody. So we talked a bit about that, about one phrase that Lucy, I'll try to quote you, that she said, remember that we are holding the responsibility and privilege to make them feel safe. So yeah, so that's something that resonated within our group. And
very well said, by the way. Yeah, absolutely.
Not mine. That's all Lucy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Carolina was brave enough to go first. So who is following our lead?
Yeah, I can jump in. My name is Vanessa, and previous to my current role, I come from a child welfare background. So this topic of resilience, ACEs, is definitely something that is really common language in child welfare, foster care services, and stuff like that. But I've seen kind of an evolution of this conversation in the past like 5 to 7 years. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts on kind of the evolution of this conversation, or like any best practices that we would want to take from that conversation as we're looking at expanding trauma-informed care for different student populations, or if there's any like bad practices we wouldn't want to carry over. So I don't know, any thoughts on kind of the evolution of this type of conversation?
Vanessa, that's a very interesting topic, actually. I haven't thought much about that, and I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what is the evolution. In a few words, what you noticed over the past 5-7 years, from where to where?
Yeah, so early on, I heard the form trauma-informed care used. You know, there was like this knowledge base of people understanding that trauma had occurred and people should respond differently and lean in with curiosity. However, the practice didn't match that. So it ended up pathologizing and stigmatizing a student population of they have trauma, and the practices, the culture didn't match with it. So I actually saw it like in a slightly negative, like people had an understanding that that young person or that student experienced something, but they didn't know how to move from that place, if that makes sense. We can also go offline if this is too in the weeds.
Well, not from me, Vanessa. No, I really appreciate. I think it's a very good point to bring up. And actually, I know exactly what you mean. And if I can respond to you, the best way that I can respond is to tell you a little bit about what I'm doing right now. In terms, one of the things that I'm doing right now is to conduct a survey, a study, a longitudinal study of medical students, nursing students, and veterinary medicine students to try to understand better what the drivers of resilience. And because the idea stemmed from exactly that I was realizing that the emphasis on trauma can be almost fulfill a role of put in double jeopardy some individuals who not only have social exclusion attached to them for various reasons, but on top of that was the label of trauma. And the trauma as something that happened and defines them, when many people, they wouldn't do that to themselves. So it's a very interesting proposal to shift, and that's why I'm proposing to shift from trauma to resilience-informed education, because then everybody applies. It's not only the traumatized, and the other idea connected to that is that trauma is a misnomer. It's the only word that we have, but maybe a better term is toxic stress. And toxic stress can be something that we don't register as trauma. And so anyway, we can go on, but very good question. Thank you.
So I think, Dr. Shola, we have time for one more question. We have a question from Lori Johnson asking, I would love to have more information on post-traumatic growth. Do you have examples of articles or websites to look?
Yes, absolutely. I can send that. Yeah, absolutely. So Ruth and I, or I can communicate with any of the organizers, and I will send you guys resources. I don't have nothing off the top of my head right now, but I can prepare for you a couple of resources, videos, books, and websites.
Thank you. Ruth, you want to take over? I think it's
time. So thank you again, Dr. Shola, for being with us today. You know, we just were enlightened so much by your words, and looking forward to, you know, reading more and finding more resources from you in the future. So, you know, we have a lot of compliments and a lot of thank yous in our chat box. So we'll make sure you get those, and any questions that are remaining, we'll, you know, he's offered to respond to those offline. So please do share those out. Thanks again.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And you all have a good rest of the day. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you again. Thanks so much. So as we're transitioning to this next section, we're going to take a minute for self-care. And we have a volunteer from our partner, Children's Partnership. We have someone, this is a surprise spotlight. So Manuel, you be listening. Her name is Nancy Olivares. Nancy Olivares. And Nancy, if you start talking, then he'll probably see you and it'll spotlight.
Okay.
We're going to take a minute for self-care. There's a lot of heavy stuff today, right? And we're going to get through our final stretch of our afternoon.
Yeah.
Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Ruth. And hi, all. My name is Nancy Olivares, again from the Children's Partnership. And I'm going to guide you through a quick self-guided meditation exercise. So if I could ask y'all to close your eyes, sit in a comfortable position, and relax your shoulders. Now take a deep breath. So breathe in through the nose, breathe out through the mouth. Breathe in, feeling the lungs expanding. Breathe out, feeling the sense, letting go. Breathe in to feel your body getting fuller. Breathe out to feel the release of any tension. Breathe in to feel awake. Breathe out to feel the muscles relaxing. Breathe in that sense of fullness. Breathe out any unnecessary tension. And when you're ready, feel free to open your eyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for that moment. It's an important thing for us to recognize. This is really hard work, and it's beautiful work, but our bodies, need our care, and our minds and souls. So thank you so much, Nancy, for that.
Thank you.
So as we close up the day, we would like to go ahead and move the slide, please. We'd like to move on, and one more slide, please. We're going to be sharing a few resources with people who, or with all of you, that some of our resources and some from our partners. And then again, as you're seeing kind of what resources are here that I'm sharing, please, again, if there's anything that you or your organization would like to share out, you can feel free to put that in the chat, or you can send us later if you have a piece. So we'll go ahead and move through. I'll just kind of share with you a few resources that we have that are coming up. Californians Together is going to be publishing very soon a new kit, a new support for immigrant and refugee students project phase 2 toolkit. It'll include classroom lesson plans, and we partnered with the Center for Equity and for English Learners, SEAL from LMU, to develop this focused on resilience and social emotional learning. This is free. It'll be free for download, and then also county offices and others will be presenting across the state over the next year, beginning in February. You could move slide, please. Change slide, please. Okay. And it's a literature-based lessons, and we'll, they're in grade level spans, K2, 3, 6, and 6, 12, aligned to the California English Language Arts and History and ELD standards. And it also includes slides and handouts. So it's a real full complete opportunity. Can you continue on, please? And they can be also downloaded by individual grade spans as well. And the links will be here for you to access those on our website. Right now, existing are the phase 1 lesson plans, which are to support safe and welcoming schools, also literature-based lessons. Okay, so let's move on quickly through our partners. So we have Children's Partnership. Obviously, you've seen them today in different aspects, and just right on the call right now, we had Nancy. They have a number of resources available, so I encourage you guys to check them out. A lot of toolkits, flyers, things of that nature, multiple languages. So check them out. Even texting apps and things to find information for families. And then again, just want to reinforce, it's just a lot of community of partners that we work with. Here are some of some very nice tools that you may be interested in checking out. And just want to acknowledge the support of the California Endowment and Blue Shield of California, as well as CABE, and we heard Erendira talk highly of the Project to Inspire program, and I think it's an important one to recognize as well. But CABE being one of our partners as well. So we could continue on. All right. So we are going to close out today. And again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and also encourage you. There is in the program and also going to be in the chat right now a link to our evaluation for this event. And that's really important for us to get feedback on what was helpful about the event, what advice you have for possibly for future events, or information to help make it better. And all of us who are nonprofits or being funded by nonprofits, we like to have the information so that we can continue to best serve the communities. So you'll see the evaluation link there, and we really would love for you to take a few minutes to do that, but not right now, not right this second, because what we have next is the final word. And the final word is going to be Kaya Lomeli again. And we can't always have students with us when we're working through these. We had some on today, but we definitely want your voice. We want to always remember that the focus is on students. And so Kaya will be our last voice of the day. And after Kaya, we are going to have an open social hour, not an hour. We'll stick around for about a half an hour. And so if there's anyone that would like to continue to go to breakouts, we're going to do little 6-minute breakouts. So that you can meet more people, interact more. I know we missed that first breakout because of time, but we'd love to encourage you if you'd like to stay and interact. And sometimes our poets and our presenters like to be able to have the opportunity to meet people, which we don't do when we're in the physical world. So encourage you to stay on the line after the poet. So thank you again. I want to acknowledge, Crystal, for your amazing technology and support for this event. All of our presenters, our panelists, our whole Californians Together team, and just thank you. Thank you for being here and for caring enough, to be part of this event. And please let people know that we did record the event. So it is going to be available for people to get, the wonderful resources and presentations that they may have missed today. So Kaya, you have the final word.
Thank you. I want to say thank you so much. This has been such an incredible experience for me to learn so much. Also, again, thank you so much to Ruth and all of our panelists for just teaching so much. But before I begin, I also sorry, I'm saying thank you a lot, but thank you to everyone who stayed here as well. As a student, it means a lot to me just to know that there's so many people who are dedicated to supporting students and families and just helping people who are facing so many different challenges. So this is my poem entitled Heritage. Every year for Dia de los Muertos on Olvera Street, I wish myself both a history and a future as bright as the painted calaveras. But it always dissolves on my tongue as soon as I try to swallow. The only words in Spanish I know by heart are the colors, numbers, days of the week. My words are always just a little out of reach. The only words I can recognize in Spanish are either curses or endearments, 2 different ways I was taught to say I love you. Unlike most days, the women who speak Spanish in the bus seat behind me do not soothe me. Their foreign tongues remind me of a home I never had. Instead of an old lullaby, today they are another part of the world I am supposed to know, but don't. I have faint memories of Christmas Eve and a birthday song I was never taught. Spanish was my first language, but I don't remember how I lost it. Sometimes on my way to school, it aches like a phantom tongue. My Spanish is a song whose rhythm I know by heart, but the lyrics were lost long ago. The one year the women in my family would have come together to make tamales from scratch is the one that my aunt got the flu. A memorized imagining of this tradition is all I've got, But when the event is canceled, what happens to all the culture it contains? This time of year, every year, I watch the festival dancers welcome the spirits back. I wonder where mine has gone. I watch my cousin among them. Neither of us know which ancestors we honor. All our welcome is faith. My grandmother says, "Mira, mija." The dancers are so beautiful. And I agree. I receive an embroidered blouse and sash like the ones the dancers wear, and my dad calls me beautiful. I loved it, but I have never worn it anywhere but the mirror. I felt so out of place. I never knew who they danced for. But at least I know that elote is best after a conversation with the vendor about how hard it is to get a permit these days. I find forgiveness in the mariachi music from the pickup truck stopped at the corner. It doesn't ask me to explain myself or why I deserve it. I pay extra attention in APUSH, the Mexican-American War, and where did these borders even come from? I laugh when my teacher confuses chudo with cholo, but I appreciate the effort. I make fun of white people who call them churros and associate them with Disneyland. I may not speak Spanish, but I remember my grandmother's accent. She sings to me in the gossip clamor of women on public transportation and the whir of street cleaners' instruments when they say good morning. I tutor at the Guadalupe Center, and I can pronounce the children's names. I teach my friends how to pronounce the children's names, and it feels more like a prayer. I whisper te amo to my baby cousin. Remind us both where we came from. Te amo, mi vida. He understands me. I'm stopped in the halls when I'm late to class, and I'm scared because my skateboard and California Chicana shirt don't exactly scream good student. The administrator says, "It's okay. You remind me of my daughter. She's so smart that she went to college. I'm so proud of her. I'm so proud of her. Now go to class." All these people I don't know tell me to look. There is a family making tamales. See how all the roads lead back home. Thank you.
Oh, take off your microphone, take off your mutes, everybody. Let's give this a round.
Thank you for sharing.
Bellísimo, Kaya, bellísimo, bellísimo. Me has hecho llorar.
Wonderful.
Gracias.
Where can we get a copy
Sure.
of that? That's a treasure.
Well, this will be recorded, so you'll have the recording. Kaya? What about a copy, Kaya?
I'll have to talk to Mason, but I'll try.
It's an original. She wrote it. Yeah. Yeah. Both of them, right, Kaya?
Yes, those are both my own writing.
Fabulous. All right, so anyone that wants to stay for our social hour, we're going to start to do a little rotation. So stay on the line, and we're going to do 6 minutes. And stay for 6, stay for 12, whatever you like. And hopefully we will see you soon.